Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. It's a late session, at least on the East Coast, so I appreciate you sticking with us. Today we're going to be talking about a Martian trade economy, or at least the basics thereof. So before we get going, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Leet. I have a PhD in international relations and comparative politics with a from George Mason University. I focused on space governance and space security for my studies. I have been a lifelong space nut, specifically for Mars. Two of the earliest grown-up books that I read as a kid were the Mars trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson and, of course, The Case for Mars. So obviously those books left a impression because here we are. I'll be presenting today with my friend and colleague, Alex Gilbert. So I'll just go ahead and hand it over to you, Alex, and then I think you're going to kick us off as well, I believe, with the slides. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. So just a quick introduction to myself. My background is in energy markets and policy, and looking particularly at natural resources and raw production. More recently, I've been attending the Colorado School of Mines for their PhD program in space resources. And in that, I focus on the economics and governance for different types of space resources. So really excited to present to this project to you today. Really what developed here is that we were talking about how do you make Mars into a competitive economic entity that if you look far down the road and you end up in a situation where there's thousands or millions of people on Mars, you're going to have some sort of interplanetary economy between Earth and Mars. And so Mars is going to need to have a key element of that. Leet?
So like Alex was saying, ultimately, Mars will still be clearly tied to Earth economies. The question is where it fits into that context. So we posit that to establish a healthy economic independence, it's going to need a healthy balance of trade with Earth. In order to do that, though, would likely need a comparative advantage in some way. So the question is, where does that come in, and what could Mars trade that would be worthwhile? So I'm just going to go with the on this one, Alex, right? And then we'll switch off.
Yeah.
So in a reversal from decades of science fiction, where Martians come for our resources, it might actually be the other way around. So the U.S. Energy Information Agency estimates that by 2050, Earth will have a total energy demand of just a bit over 5,100 gigawatt years. Roughly 50% of that will be demand for renewable energy. So if you look at this chart that we've got here, all the data is from the EIA. You'll note that not only is the total amount of renewable energy needed in 2050 larger in absolute terms, but it also constitutes a larger percentage of the overall total. This has potential resilience and reliability implications because many forms of renewable energy are, by their nature, intermittent and may not always be as dispatchable or steady state as a traditional large baseload power station. So there's not only a need for more renewable energy, but there's also going to be a need for more dispatchable baseload power circa 2050 as well. So plausibly, if somebody were able to meet both of those demands, it would be a substantial economic boon for them. Alex?
Yeah, so in kind of looking at this as a potential market opportunity, I mean, the energy markets worldwide are currently $1 trillion plus markets. And so we start thinking about what is the role that Mars could play here? And so is this something that you could develop as some sort of export for Mars? And we think there is a case for that. And it kind of starts by looking at the specific energy circumstances on Mars itself. So one of the big challenges with doing any sort of Martian settlement or industrial activity is that you don't really have a lot of the same energy resources that you have here on Earth. There's no, as far as we know, abundant reserves of fossil fuels. Solar energy is relatively weak there, so even though you don't have as much atmosphere to block it out, or as much weather systems, you just don't have as much energy production there. And so you're going to need to produce a lot of panels, and you still have to deal with intermittency. there's probably not enough air pressure to do significant amounts of wind. There could be some geothermal, but we don't have that well defined. And while we could use nuclear there, there's not necessarily a lot of accessible resources, at least as far as we're aware right now. So when you're looking at this from a Martian perspective, how can Mars develop some sort of competitive advantage or some sort of reason on the energy, some sort of advantage on energy production? And we think that this is where space-based solar power comes in. And that's because it meets a lot of potential demand on Mars, and it can particularly deal with some of the issues of solar power related to dust storms. So if this is a technology that you can develop in terms of leadership on Mars, develop the technical expertise, then Mars could have a competitive advantage. Leet?
Yeah, so, and just to level set here, not to get too remedial, but we'll just, as a reminder here, so when we're talking about comparative advantage, basic international trade theory, and again, simplifying, so any economists in the audience don't eat me. But the best balance of trade for both parties in an international trade arrangement is generally achieved when they each focus on producing items in which they have a comparative advantage. Comparative advantage, in this case, being an economy's ability to produce a particular good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners. Doing so allows them to have larger margins, which allows them to make more money directly, or they can potentially undercut competitors and capture a larger segment of the market, or any number of other things. So then the question is, and where does Mars possibly have an economic advantage over Earth? We've already sort of, spoiled the plot twist here, but it's a matter of energy. And of course, can't just string up transmission lines between Mars and Earth, even if that did make sense. So, as Alex stated, we posit that space-based solar power satellites sort of provide that advantage. Did you want to keep going on this one, Alex, or did you want to take this one?
Yeah, this one you have a better handle on.
Okay. Yeah, so again, despite the energy poverty of Mars that we talked about earlier, its comparative advantage is ironically a matter of energy. So if you look at this figure on the right of the screen, this is a delta V map that shows very roughly, it's obviously not detailed calculations here, the delta V budget to get from one place in the solar system to another on a minimum energy trajectory. In theory, by adding the values between each node in between your start and your finish point, you get a total delta V requirement in kilometers per second. And there are many such maps like this out there that you can find. So before proceeding, I'm just going to level set a little bit. I'm sure most people here know what delta V is, but just to clarify, this is the delta, as in the Greek letter delta, meaning change in V, velocity. To get anywhere in space, you need to change your velocity to do that, usually via propulsion, but also potentially through aerobraking or gravity assist maneuvers and what have you. But the bottom line is that the bigger the delta V, the bigger the velocity change you need to get to another place in space, and that means that more energy you're expending. So a really interesting thing sort of pops out of this map if you play around with the numbers a bit. It turns out that geosynchronous orbit around Earth is actually closer to Mars's surface, energetically speaking, than it is to Earth's surface. So I'll save you the trouble of counting the dots on your laptop screen and adding on the fly, but that works out to about 9.3 kilometers per second from Mars's surface to geosynchronous orbit around Earth, versus about 13.1 kilometers per second from Earth's surface to geo. And that's before you factor in things like the potential for aerobraking, which would reduce that, which is something that an Earth-based producer couldn't really take advantage of when launching to geo. And of course, it's substantially lower than even that if you're launching from Deimos. So to effectively leverage this comparative advantage, you need to target an area or market that is hard to get to from Earth. And things like direct return of goods and services to Earth's surface are obviously going to be economic, and returning raw materials would be even more so from Mars. So this is where we get to our main thrust here. So
Yeah, so what we did is we looked at this idea of using space-based solar power because we believe it's an area that Mars would need to develop on its own. It's something that it makes a lot of sense for the Martian surface. It's something that you'd want to probably develop in orbit, and so you'd have orbital manufacturing facilities, and so that would be up near Deimos. And you potentially use some of the moons of Mars to actually make the space-based solar power systems themselves. But by developing this for Mars itself to get it to any sort of scale, you would then have the technology and the capabilities to then produce that and then transfer it to geosynchronous Earth orbit. And so what we did is we did an initial economic analysis based on the Mars Society's recent Mars City State competition. So that would be about 1 million people on Mars, what you would need to do, and how much economic activity would be involved in that. And so we took several of the assumptions there to kind of model what this would look like. We specifically assumed a concerted effort to create the large Martian settlement. We had an estimate of transit costs of $500 per kilogram from Earth to Mars and $200 from Mars to Earth. And we then levelized this cost to the per kilometer per second level, so we could estimate the cost for Mars, Deimos, and Earth transport to different places in stellar space. So as you can kind of see in this somewhat detailed chart of our analysis, that by the middle of phase 2, which we would have as around about the year 2050 and about 25 years in the settlement process, you can get to a significant positive trade balance. We would estimate around $18 billion because you're able to access this Earth market and take advantage of this energy balance. And so importantly, one of the key things here is that you are using high technology and you're using your advantages that you would develop in Martian orbit, but you're transferring something to Earth that's intangible, that you're not actually going to do a physical good. You're not competing in Earth markets with a physical good. You're providing the energy services from space from an area that's hard for them to access. Leet?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So we'll just go into a little bit here about what it is we're actually talking about, because not everyone may be familiar with this. That again, forgive me if this is remedial for some of you, but what we're essentially talking about is a large gigawatt class space-based solar power satellite in geosynchronous orbit around the planet Earth. So space-based solar power systems basically have 3 main components, right? So you've got the collector, which in this case is a large photovoltaic array that collects incident sunlight, converts it into DC electricity. Then you have the beaming system, which converts that electricity into microwaves, which is then beamed towards a target on the planet. And then the third component is the ground station. Essentially what this, and then the ground station converts the incident microwaves into DC electricity, which can then be dispatched into the grid just like any other generating station. So there's some unique characteristics of the microwave technology at certain wavelengths that allow it to have high quality power transfer even through weather. And to preempt a question that a lot of people ask when they first hear about this technology, at the ground station, the beam is diffusive enough that it's not going to be harmful to animals or equipment. And another sort of factor with the ground station is that because it's largely just sort of a collection of wires, effectively, it's partially or largely transparent. So it could potentially be co-located with farmland or solar farms or what have you. So even the land use factor is somewhat less of a concern than with other large physical plants. But that said, the rectenna on the ground would be on the order of kilometers across. So it's a substantial piece of equipment. But it does help that pretty much all of the component technologies are fairly advanced, even if they're not all, even if the integration and scaling still might need some work. So then we'll just go ahead and talk about some of the unique benefits of such space-based solar power. Do you want to take this one, Alex?
Yeah, for sure. So this built on some other research that Leet and I have done and kind of building on our experience in energy markets. But space-based solar power is a really unique energy resource compared to other types of energy resources that we use. First of all, probably most importantly, it is carbon-free generation, so it joins the portfolio of clean energy technologies that the energy transition globally is heading towards. This has led to significant government interest in developing this technology across the board. Unlike a lot of other renewable technologies, it provides steady baseload or dispatchable power. The capacity factor here is exceptionally high. A lot of the systems that are modeled are close to 99% and above, which is better even than a nuclear facility, which does have to shut down for operations and maintenance. And one of the things that's really interesting here that we see on the market side is that because of how the beaming works, you're able to participate and serve in multiple energy markets. And so the way the energy markets work right now, because transmission is so difficult on Earth to do, you have pretty significant price disparities across markets. Sometimes prices can be hundreds of dollars more or 10 to 20 times higher, only a couple hundred miles away. And so if you're able to figure out a network of these stations, then you can essentially price target across a large region, including multiple countries. And that's something that we don't see in power right now. And so it's really can open up a lot of opportunities and it can be more competitive than I think a very simple analysis of, say, levelized cost of energy would expect. And from the cost innovation side, while getting this to scale and getting the beaming technology up and going are definitely challenges, the basic technologies are here in terms of having a solar, a photovoltaic or other generation panel, having a truss, and then having the rectenna stations themselves. Wait.
Yeah. And so to sort of pull this all together, right, because of Earth's deep gravity well, these gigawatt class SBSP systems, which are substantial pieces of equipment, can be built by a producer on Mars and shipped fully or mostly assembled to geosynchronous orbit at a price that is lower than is achievable by a terrestrial manufacturer operator. And this is largely due to the fact that the transportation costs dominate the cost structure. The photovoltaic films themselves may have to be produced on Mars, but many of the structural components could plausibly be constructed on Deimos out of local materials, either from Deimos itself or from asteroid mining and what have you. We estimated that based on sort of EIA estimates of energy prices and demand, we estimated that capturing just half of 1% of the estimated market for renewable energy alone would yield a gross revenue of approximately 11 billion, which as referenced earlier in that chart. And we estimate that this would require about half a dozen 2 gigawatt class space-based solar power units. So it's a substantial construction effort, but yeah. So in addition to materials, notably, it would also be cheaper to send construction and O&M crews to GEO from the Mars system than from Earth as well. These specialists could plausibly charge less than their terrestrial counterparts while still underbidding them because of the disparity in transfer costs. So we still need to do a much more in-depth economic analysis of this proposal, but because of the transport costs, because the transport costs do dominate, we believe that Mars should maintain its comparative advantage unless the manufacturing and whatnot turns out to be much more expensive than we would expect it to be. So yeah, you want to start off on this one, Alex? I'll probably chime in, or I can do it.
So just kind of wrapping up and focusing on how do we get from where we are to kind of this vision. So first of all, there are a number of different things that you would have to surmount to be successful here. A lot of this is going to relate to base technology and regulatory issues for base-based solar power. And so a lot of these things will probably end up being solved in the next several decades on Earth. But then going from there, you'd want to have a specialized focus on these technologies for Mars applications. One thing that really did jump out to at least me about this research is by having this kind of gravity difference and having this this delta V advantage for Mars, it does allow you to potentially have some sort of physical good involved in a balance of trade between Earth and Mars. And I think a lot of visions of how things could work down the line with having a very large Martian settlement is that Martian companies and people would be primarily dedicated to intangible products like intellectual property, technologies, entertainment, those type of things that you can transfer wirelessly and really easily. But that's going to be very difficult to fully establish an independent community that has a true balance of trade. And if you look at terrestrial economies between countries, you really need diversified trade, including physical goods. And so this is something that we see this as a high technology, and that's something that we think that Mars would be especially competitive with. And then we also identify this gravity and delta V situation as really potentially being advantageous. Leet?
Yeah, no, well said. And I just point out that another thing that with these intangible goods, right, like software development or financial services or whatever, our Martians would be effectively competing on equal footing with similar professionals on Earth, right? Because they don't have that built-in comparative advantage that we get from the delta V differential, delta V delta. So, you know, that's certainly something, so that's another thing to keep in mind. While we did in our economic analysis, we did factor in professional services, but they'd be just competing on the same terms. So yeah, I think, and you know, as we get closer, there are, as Alex sort of alluded to, there are certainly some risks. But we don't think that any of them are definitely insurmountable. I mean, even the technological risk, like let's say that somebody comes along and actually develops a workable fusion power, right? Plausibly, that would undercut the market share of space-based solar power. But because of those unique characteristics of SBSP that we were talking about earlier, we think that even then it should be fairly resilient to those sorts of challenges. So, and again, I'll just sort of wrap up by saying that, you know, while we did emphasize the power markets in this presentation, certainly the same logic applies to other goods and service, space-based goods and services served to the geosynchronous orbit around Earth, which is a market that by some estimates will be worth well over $1 trillion per year by 2050. So capturing even a tiny percentage of that market yields big bucks. So before we hand it over to questions, any final thoughts, Alex?
No, I think you wrapped it up well, Leet.
Great. Okay. Well, so that's it. Looks like we have a few minutes per questions. Any questions or comments from the audience?
Yeah. Hello. This is Rennie. I'm now the co-host to the session. Susan had to leave because she's actually going to be giving the next presentation in this track. So she had to depart early. But I do have a couple of questions in the Q&A here that I can read to you guys that you can answer.
Sure.
So the first one is from John. Wouldn't accessing the materials from the moon be cheaper than from Mars?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, especially if you look at just the timing of any sort of launch or anything like that. There's two things that we think are important there. One is this idea of kind of high technology. So when you look at the moon's energy situation, it's in a very different position than Mars. A lot of places that they're looking at are close to the, at least in the near term, are close to the lunar poles. And so you have close to near complete access to sunlight. The solar generation that you have there is a lot higher. Even if you are in an equatorial region, it's a 14-day, 14-night cycle, and it has very high certainty. Getting through the night is a challenge, but it's something that you can definitely do. There are opportunities to do some space-based solar power for lunar settlements or activities. But because of how the orbits work, with the way the three-body Earth, Moon, Sun system works, there's not a lot of stable orbits on the moon compared to, say, Mars or, say, Earth. And so Mars, for a high technology like space-based solar power, is especially well suited. The moon, I think, would be in a good position to do something like pure commodities. And so if you're providing water, or even to a degree, we were actually thinking that one thing that could happen would be providing materials from the moon for orbital manufacturing in Mars, where you have stable orbits and established populations, to then have things go back to Earth orbit.
Okay.
Yeah, no, well said, Alex. And I'd also just note that, you know, I think in many ways, and it's always, you know, this is all, but in many ways, Mars is, you know, a much more hospitable environment and could plausibly support a larger population. And because the sort of the power sales economy that we're in trade balance that we're talking about here, it's scalable, right, to the population. So that's potentially another advantage, but otherwise I think Alex really nailed it.
Okay. Next question is from Stephen. What about multilateral trade with the asteroids and the moon?
Yeah, that's a great one. You know, of course, it's all sort of hypothetical because we don't know what that would look like, but we did, you know, factor in, you know, the potential for trade from the asteroids for materials specifically, you know, for the structural components, the trusses, and, you know, hardware and what have you. And again, when it comes to the moon, I think you could plausibly also send power satellites that would service, you know, settlements on the moon as well. So the same basic logic applies. You know, and again, getting back to the delta V differential, the other thing is that the delta V differential between the moon to geosynchronous orbit and Deimos to geosynchronous orbit actually isn't that large. So even if you were launching things from the moon, it wouldn't make a huge difference. But yeah, no, we did, that's a much broader study to be sure, but we certainly did think about that sort of trilateral trade. Alex?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think that it's a great question. One thing I would just say there is that the trade is definitely possible, but we were really kind of thinking about if you do get to a scalable Martian settlement and you have a lot of people there, that establishing a balance of trade becomes an economic imperative. If you're continue to keep a flow of goods, and particularly high value goods you might not be able to produce on Mars from Earth to Mars, you need to be able to establish a clear high demand supply to Earth in order to create that balance of trade and to enable even just like basic things like having enough currency and other things like that to be able to get what you want in terms of imports.
The next question, I'm not sure if it's a question or comment. John McDonald, if you want to unmute yourself, maybe you could ask your question or let us know if it's a comment, and I'm not sure which answer you were referring to.
Sure. So I actually was responding to a different person on my initial comment, but my question actually is space-based solar power is a very interesting concept, but have you considered mining platinum group metals from Phobos and Deimos? I've done a little bit of calculating on it. It seems particularly interesting, and I'm curious about your thoughts.
We hadn't really considered that in the context of this study, no, sort of out of scope, but that is sort of an interesting prospect. So when you say that you find that interesting, do you mean it's potentially economically competitive?
It certainly looks like it. I mean, just I've been doing a little bit of research on it, and assuming that Phobos and Deimos are, in fact, effectively carbonaceous chondrite asteroids, the amount of platinum and the amount of processing seems like it would be something that could become economically viable, even if you were to take the platinum back down into Earth's gravity well, which I honestly found surprising and intriguing.
No, that is interesting. We hadn't really looked at that, so thanks for flagging it for us. Any thoughts, Alex?
I would just say that when it comes to a lot of precious metal markets, when things have very high value for mass, one of the biggest issues is that the markets are usually volumetrically small. And so any sort of large scale thing to kind of get to the $1 billion plus range for a commodity, you get close to crashing the commodity market in the short term, and that just becomes really hard to finance.
Okay, well, that's all of our time. So thanks, guys, for the presentation. Very interesting. And there is one last question in the chat room. If you guys want to try to respond to that, that'd be great. But appreciate everybody's time, and thanks for attending the session.
Thanks very much for having us. Much appreciated. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.